They ordered her to shut up, but they didn't know who she was. Not until the general arrived, the man who commanded armies and feared nothing, saw her face and froze in utter terror. That was the moment everything changed. Before that, she was just the old woman in the supply office, the one they told to be quiet. Anya Petrova arrived at Forward Operating Base Nightingale on a Tuesday, carried in on the tail end of a dust-clogged supply convoy. The base was an angry boil on the sun-scorched landscape of the Zargos foothills, a place of dust, diesel fumes, and perpetual low-grade tension. Her transfer papers were simple, almost insultingly so. Anya Petrova, logistics clerk, grade 4, she was 58 years old, with hair the color of ash and a face mapped with lines that spoke not of laughter, but of long, patient observation. She moved with a quiet economy, her steps measured, her gaze sweeping her surroundings without seeming to. The quartermaster's office was a cramped, metal-sided container baking under the relentless sun. Inside, two young specialists, barely out of their teens, were arguing over a music playlist while half-heartedly updating inventory spreadsheets. They glanced up, saw a woman old enough to be their grandmother, and immediately dismissed her. Sergeant Miles, the NCO in charge, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his uniform, pointed to a rickety desk in the corner piled high with unfiled manifests. "That's you," he grunted, his attention already back on a sports magazine. "Keep the paperwork straight. Stay out of the way." Anya said nothing. She placed her single, austere duffel bag beside the desk and began to work. She didn't clear the whole pile as a younger, more eager person might. Instead, she methodically sorted it, her fingers moving with a practiced dexterity that was at odds with her age. She created 3 stacks: urgent, pending, and archive. The specialists watched her for a moment, a flicker of curiosity in their eyes, before the beat dropped on a new song and they lost interest. In that first hour, Anya learned the pulse of the base. She learned that the generators on the west perimeter faltered every 47 minutes, a telltale dip in the current causing the lights in her container to flicker. She noted that the outgoing patrols always left through the north gate, their vehicles bunching up in a predictable pattern, creating a tempting target. On her walk from the landing zone, she'd noticed a section of the razor wire fence where the tension was off, a subtle sag indicating a potential weak point. Her mind cataloged these details automatically, a habit forged over a lifetime of seeing the world not as it appeared, but as a system of strengths and vulnerabilities. She spent the afternoon creating a new inventory system on her outdated terminal. The existing one was a mess, with ghost entries for equipment that had been destroyed months ago and critical shortages that were not flagged. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. When Sergeant Miles bellowed for a count on MREs, one of the specialists spent 10 minutes fumbling through the digital records. Anya, without looking up from her screen, said, 7,112 units. We have a surplus of Menu C, but we will be out of Menu B by Friday. The next shipment is not scheduled for 10 days. I suggest a ration adjustment. Miles stared at her. The two specialists stopped their music. The silence in the container was thick. How the hell would you know that? Miles demanded. Anya tapped a key on her keyboard. A neatly formatted table appeared on her screen. I reconciled the incoming manifests against the daily issue logs from the last 3 months, she said, her voice flat, devoid of pride or challenge. The data was all there. Sergeant Miles walked over, peered at the screen, and grunted again. It was a different kind of grunt this time, one tinged with reluctant surprise. He didn't say thank you. He just walked back to his desk and slammed his magazine down. For the rest of the day, the music in the quartermaster's office was noticeably quieter. Anya Petrova had begun her work, and the first tiny gear in the vast machine of FOB Nightingale had clicked into a new, more efficient position. She was still just the old woman in the corner, but a seed of doubt had been planted. She was not what she seemed. The dismissal came, as she knew it would, from a place of higher authority. Colonel Marcus Thorne was a man carved from the rigid granite of military doctrine. He had a square jaw, a haircut you could set your watch by, and an unshakable belief in the chain of command and his own strategic acumen. He viewed the world through the lens of flowcharts and operational acronyms, and he had little patience for anything that didn't fit neatly into one of his boxes. Anya Petrova, the superannuated logistics clerk, did not fit. He held his morning briefing in the Tactical Operations Center, a cavern of humming servers and glowing screens where the air tasted of stale coffee and anxiety. Thorne stood before a large digital map, outlining a new route for the armored supply convoys that were the base's lifeline. Insurgent activity had spiked, and the main supply route had become a shooting gallery. Intelligence has identified a new corridor, designated Route Crimson, Thorne announced, tracing a red line on the map with a laser pointer. It's a paved road, allows for greater speed, and bypasses the two most recent ambush sites. We'll run the first convoy at 1,400 hours. Questions? Anya was there because a standing order required all section NCOs or their civilian equivalents to attend. Sergeant Miles had gleefully delegated the duty to her. She had been standing silently in the back, a ghost among the uniformed officers, but her eyes had been locked on the map. She saw not a line but a trap. She raised a single, steady hand. Colonel Thorne's gaze swept past her, then snapped back, his brow furrowing in annoyance. He didn't know who she was. He saw only a gray-haired woman in a drab civilian work shirt. Yes, he clipped, his tone dripping with condescension. You're from Quartermaster. Yes, sir, Anya said, her voice calm and even, carrying easily across the hushed room. That route, it funnels into the Al-Qadir Pass. The road narrows for 3 kilometers. The cliffs on either side create a natural kill box. There's no room to maneuver and no cover. The satellite imagery is outdated. Recent rock slides have made it even more constricted. A murmur went through the assembled officers. Thorne's face tightened, a flush of anger rising on his neck. He was being questioned by a clerk, in front of his men. "And you know this how?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I cross-referenced the topographical data with geological surveys from the 1970s and recent seismic activity reports," Anya stated simply. "The area is unstable. It is the logical place for an ambush. They won't have to fight you. They'll just have to seal the entrance and the exit." She pointed to a faint, barely visible track on the map, miles to the east. "The old goat trails through the Umbra Deeps. The ground is harder there, slower but safer. It offers multiple egress points." Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Goat trails? Clerk, we are running 50-ton armored vehicles, not a herd of livestock. Those trails are unmapped, unsecure, and completely unsuitable. We stick to the plan. Route Crimson is the fastest way." He turned to his adjutant, Captain Eva Rostova. "Captain, make a note. Strategic briefings are for personnel with the relevant clearance and expertise. See that our logistics staff are not burdened with attending in the future." He then looked directly at Anya, his eyes cold as ice. "That will be all. Your input is not required." The order was implicit but absolute. "Shut up. Go back to your manifests and your blankets and leave the war to the soldiers." Anya's expression did not change. There was no flash of anger, no hint of humiliation. She simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked out of the TOC. The officers watched her go, a mix of pity and discomfort on their faces. They had just seen a woman quietly and thoroughly humiliated by their commanding officer. Colonel Thorne, his authority reasserted, turned back to the map, but the red line of Route Crimson now seemed to glow with a faint, menacing light. He had made his decision, and Anya Petrova, back in her dusty container, knew he had just sentenced men to death. Anya returned to the quartermaster's container and sat at her desk. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant pop-pop of a firing range, the low murmur of the bass, it all faded into a background hum. She did not feel anger at Colonel Thorne's rebuke. Anger was a luxury, an indulgence she had discarded decades ago. What she felt was a cold, heavy certainty, the familiar weight of watching a preventable disaster unfold. The colonel was a product of a system that valued confidence over competence, procedure over reality. He saw a line on a map. She saw a grave. She pulled up the base's digital archives on her terminal. Her security clearance was laughably low, restricting her from accessing anything classified. But Anya didn't need classified intelligence. She needed data, and data, she knew, was everywhere if you knew how to look. She found the geological surveys she'd mentioned, dusty PDF scans of documents created by a British petroleum company half a century ago. She overlaid them with public domain satellite imagery from a European space agency, tweaking the spectrum filters to highlight mineral composition and soil density. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed that belied her age. She wrote a simple script to pull weather data from 3 different international meteorological services, compiling information on wind patterns and barometric pressure trends over the Zagros region. A pattern emerged, a subtle but undeniable pressure drop that the base's own weather station, poorly calibrated and ignored, had missed. A sandstorm was coming. Not a small squall, but a major one, a wall of sand and fury that would blind sensors and ground all aircraft. It would arrive in approximately 5 hours, just as Thorne's convoy would be deepest inside the Al-Qadir Pass. Corporal Kenji Tanaka, a young communications tech with intelligent eyes and a perpetually curious expression, came in with a tray of insulated mugs. He was on a self-appointed mission to keep the various support sections caffeinated. He offered a mug to Anya. "Coffee, ma'am?" he asked, his voice respectful. He was one of the few who called her ma'am instead of ignoring her. "Thank you, Corporal," she said, accepting it without breaking her concentration. Tanaka lingered for a moment, his eyes drawn to her screen. It didn't look like an inventory sheet. It was a complex tapestry of layered maps, weather charts, and lines of code. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Doesn't look like supply requisitions." "Old maps," Anya replied, her voice neutral. "Sometimes they tell you more than the new ones." Tanaka nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He saw the intensity in her focus, the way she inhabited the space around her desk as if it were the command console of the entire world. He'd heard the whispers about her exchange with Colonel Thorne in the TOC. The other clerks, Miles included, had mocked her. Goat trails, they'd snickered. But Tanaka felt a prickle of unease. He had a sense that the colonel had made a mistake, not by rejecting her idea, but by failing to listen. Anya continued her work. She wasn't just mapping the terrain. She was building a simulation in her head. She plotted the convoy's likely speed, the insurgents' optimal ambush positions, the effect of the impending storm on visibility and communications. The conclusion was always the same. The convoy would be trapped, blinded, and systematically dismantled. Thorne's failure was not one of courage, but of imagination. He couldn't imagine a logistics clerk knowing more than his entire intelligence staff. He couldn't imagine that the unassuming woman he'd dismissed was, at that very moment, the only person at FOB Nightingale who truly understood the geography of the unfolding disaster. The storm was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The first radio transmission came through at 14:53, a burst of static and panic that sliced through the mundane afternoon hum of the TOC. "Contact! Contact! Ambush in the pass! IED strike on the lead vehicle!" Colonel Thorne, who had been reviewing drone footage from another sector, stiffened. He strode to the main comm station, grabbing the handset. "Red 1, this is Nightingale Actual. Report your situation. Over." The voice that came back was young, strained, and terrified. It was Lieutenant Miller, the convoy commander. "Actual, they're on the cliffs. RPGs. We're boxed in. Lead vehicle is disabled and blocking the road. Rear guard is taking heavy fire." On the main screen, the GPS icons for the convoy, codenamed Crimson 1, were clustered together on the red line Thorne had so confidently drawn. They were right where Anya had said they would be, deep inside the Al-Qadir Pass. "Hold your position, Crimson 1," Thorne ordered, his voice tight. "Air support is on its way." He turned to the air controller. "Get me a gunship." The controller, a young captain, shook his head, his face pale. "Sir, A massive sandstorm just hit the forward airfields. Everything is grounded. Visibility is dropping to zero across the entire sector. Just then, the lights in the TOC flickered and dimmed as the wind outside began to howl. A low, rising moan that sounded like a beast awakening. Sand began to whip against the container's metal walls. The pressure in the room mounted, becoming a physical entity. The calm, controlled environment of the command center was dissolving into chaos. Thorne's orders became sharper, more frantic. He called for drone overwatch, but the storm blinded them. He tried to raise the convoy again, but the transmission was breaking up, swallowed by atmospheric interference and the sheer rock walls of the pass. The men of Crimson One were trapped, isolated, and being slaughtered. The officers in the TOC looked at their commander, their confidence in him eroding with every crackle of static, every gust of wind against the building. They were watching his plan, his certainty, get torn to shreds in real time. Thorne's face was a mask of grim fury, the face of a man wrestling with the sudden, violent intrusion of a reality he had refused to acknowledge. He was shouting for solutions, for options, for anything that would give him back control. But there were no solutions. The storm had taken his eyes. The terrain had taken his maneuverability. The enemy had taken the initiative. All of his assets, his aircraft, his technology, his authority were rendered useless. He was as blind and helpless as the men dying in the pass. The pressure continued to build, a suffocating blanket of failure and fear. The room was filled with the sounds of panicked voices and the shrieking wind, a symphony of a disaster that had been announced, ignored, and was now tragically underway. Into this vortex of chaos, Anya Petrova walked. She moved with the same unhurried, deliberate pace as always, a small gray island of calm in a sea of panic. The guards at the entrance to the TOC were too distracted to stop her. The officers were too focused on the dying radio signals. She passed behind Colonel Thorne, who was now leaning over a console, his knuckles white, and went to a secondary communication station that was being ignored. She sat down, her movements fluid and economical, and pulled on a headset. Her eyes scanned the frequency logs, her mind instantly processing the cascade of information. She found the convoy's channel, a faint signal buried beneath layers of static. Corporal Tanaka, the young comms tech, saw her and started to move, intending to tell her she wasn't authorized. But he stopped. There was something in her posture, an absolute and unshakable authority that had nothing to do with rank. Thorne finally noticed her. He turned, his face contorted with rage. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Get out of that chair. That's a secure channel." Anya ignored him. She adjusted the gain and squelch on the radio, her fingers dancing over the controls, filtering out the storm's electronic noise with a skill that left Tanaka breathless. The faint voice of Lieutenant Miller, now hoarse with desperation, became clearer. "Can't see them. Taking fire from all sides. We have multiple casualties." Anya pressed the transmit button. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the room and the static on the line with crystalline clarity. "Lieutenant Miller, this is Quartermaster. I have a way out. Stop trying to see the enemy. You are going to listen to me. Acknowledge." There was a pause. In the TOC, everyone froze. Thorne looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. On the radio, a confused voice came back. "Who is this?" "Quartermaster." "Acknowledge, Lieutenant," Anya repeated, her tone hardening just enough to command obedience. "Acknowledged," Miller stammered. "Good," Anya said. "Now orient your vehicle. Your compass is unreliable in this storm. Use your front right tire as 12 o'clock. Turn your vehicle to face what would be your 2 o'clock position. Do it now." "But that's a rock wall," Miller protested. "It is not a wall," Anya stated with absolute certainty. "It is a scree slope. It looks solid, but it's loose rock. Your vehicle is heavy enough to push through it. Drive forward for 15 meters. The ground will feel soft, then it will firm up. You will be in a narrow wadi. It will shelter you from the RPG fire. Move." Thorne started forward, his hand outstretched to physically pull her from the chair. Petrova, stand down. That's an order. Major Coulson, Thorne's second in command, a pragmatic man with tired eyes, put a hand on the colonel's arm. Sir, he said quietly, his voice firm, let her work. What other option do we have? Thorne stopped, his arm trembling with fury and helplessness. He looked at the map, then at the calm, focused woman who was now the convoy's only hope. He was no longer in command. The clerk he had dismissed was. She was navigating his men through a deadly maze, using a map that existed only in her mind, her voice a lifeline through the heart of the storm. A collective, silent awe fell over the tactical operations center. The shouting ceased. The frantic running around stopped. Every officer, from Colonel Thorne down to the junior lieutenants, stood frozen, their attention fixed on the quiet woman at the secondary comm station. They listened as her voice, a calm and steady metronome against the chaotic rhythm of the storm, guided the remnants of Crimson One through the blind pass. Lieutenant Miller, Anya's voice was patient, like a teacher guiding a student through a complex problem. The wadi will curve to the left in approximately 200 meters. Stay close to the right wall. The ground on the left is soft sand, you'll get bogged down. Maintain a speed of no more than 10 kilometers per hour. Copy that, quartermaster. Miller's voice came back, the panic gone, replaced by a focused obedience. 200 meters, hugging the right wall. Corporal Tanaka was now actively assisting her, his initial shock replaced by a feverish purpose. He rerouted auxiliary power to her console, boosting her signal. On a side monitor, he pulled up the schematics for her layered map, the one he had glimpsed earlier. He now saw it for what it was, a masterpiece of intelligence analysis. She had integrated geological data, historical water flow patterns, and even anecdotal reports from local tribal sources she must have found buried in some forgotten archive. She had built a three-dimensional understanding of the terrain that was more real than any satellite image. Thorne watched, his face a granite mask of disbelief. He had planned this operation on a two-dimensional screen. Anya Petrova was seeing it in 4 dimensions, factoring in terrain, weather, and time. She wasn't just guessing. She was navigating from memory, a memory built from pure data. She was their eyes. You will come to a fork, Anya continued. It will not be obvious. There will be a single dead acacia tree on your left. Take the right fork. It will lead you upward onto a small plateau. The insurgents will not expect you to go high. How do you know that tree is there? The major whispered to no one in particular. Tanaka, overhearing, pointed to a line of text in Anya's data. It was an entry from a 19th-century British explorer's journal, digitized and stored on a university server. It described a lone, withered tree marking a split in the path, a landmark for desert travelers. She had found it, cross-referenced its likely position, and factored it into her escape route. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The room was so quiet that the hum of the servers seemed like a roar. All they could hear was Anya's voice and Miller's strained acknowledgments. Then, a new voice came over the radio, filled with elation. We're on the plateau. We're clear of the pass. I can see. It's just sand and wind. But we're out. Crimson One is out of the kill box. A wave of relief washed through the TOC so powerful it was almost a physical force. Someone let out a choked sob. Major Coulson closed his eyes and leaned against a console, his shoulders slumping. Colonel Thorne stood ramrod straight, his expression unreadable, but the rigid certainty had been sandblasted away, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. He looked at Anya Petrova, not as a clerk, but as a phenomenon he could not comprehend. The balance of power in the room had not just shifted. It had been fundamentally and irrevocably overturned. The immediate crisis was over, but the danger was not. Crimson One was safe from the ambush, but they were now stranded on an exposed plateau, low on fuel, with wounded men and the storm still raging. The insurgents, robbed of their prize, would be regrouping, using their local knowledge to intercept the crippled convoy. The first test had been one of tactical survival. The second would be one of strategic escape. The atmosphere in the TOC had transformed. The panic was gone, replaced by a tense, focused silence. All eyes were now on Anya. Colonel Thorne, his pride shattered but his duty as a commander resurfacing, took a deep breath. He walked over to her station, not with the swagger of a superior, but with the hesitant steps of a man seeking counsel. He stopped beside her chair. The entire room held its breath. "Clerk, Petrova," Thorne began, the name feeling foreign and inadequate on his tongue. He cleared his throat. "What do you suggest we do now?" It was a question, but it was also a surrender. It was an admission of his failure and an acknowledgement of her astonishing competence. He was handing her the reins. Anya didn't look up at him immediately. She was still studying the data streams, her mind processing the new variables. The convoy's location, their remaining fuel, the storm's projected path. Finally, she swiveled in her chair to face him, her expression as impassive as ever. She pointed a single, steady finger at the map on the main screen, which Tanaka had now switched to display her custom-built topographical model. "The insurgents believe they have two options," she said, her voice crisp and analytical. "Either you will try to wait out the storm on the plateau, or you will try to retreat back the way you came. They will move to block both of those options." She traced two red arrows on the screen, indicating the enemy's most probable movements. "They will be confident. They believe they control the terrain, and the weather gives them cover from our air assets." She then drew a new line, a green one, leading away from the convoy's current position. It led not toward the base, but deeper into the desert, toward a jagged spine of mountains barely visible on the map. "They will not expect us to advance. We will use their aggression against them. A small, fast-moving rescue team can be dispatched now, on foot or with light all-terrain vehicles. The storm will cover their approach." She zoomed in on a specific point in the mountains. "Here, this is a series of caves, used by smugglers for centuries. They are dry and defensible. The rescue team will rendezvous with Crimson One here." She tapped another point on the map, miles away from the caves. "And while they are moving toward the rendezvous, you will task a drone, once the storm abates enough for a signal, to circle this area." She indicated a boxy canyon near the original ambush site. "The insurgents are commanded by a man named Al-Jamil. His tactical signature is caution mixed with arrogance. He will have a centralized command post, close enough to observe but far enough to be safe. Based on the ambush layout and the terrain, it will be here. The drone will make them think we are looking for them there. It will hold their attention while our people exfiltrate in the opposite direction." It was a plan of stunning elegance and audacity. It didn't just save the convoy. It turned the entire situation on its head, using the enemy's own tactics and assumptions to mask a daring rescue. It was a strategy born not from a textbook, but from a deep, intuitive understanding of human nature and the harsh logic of the desert. Thorne stared at the map, at the lines she had drawn, seeing the battlefield in a way he had never seen it before. He was no longer looking at a clerk. He was looking at a master strategist. Just as Thorne gave the order to assemble the rescue team based on Anya's plan, the wail of the storm was momentarily overcome by a new sound. The deep, throaty roar of a heavy transport jet making a difficult landing. A hush fell over the TOC. No flights were scheduled. No one was supposed to be able to land in these conditions. Minutes later, the door to the TOC burst open and a figure strode in, flanked by two grim-faced aides. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with a presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. His uniform was crisp, his shoulders adorned with the 4 stars of a full general. It was General Sterling, the Supreme Commander of the Regional Special Operations Command. He was a living legend, a man who had led clandestine missions in every hellhole on the planet for 40 years. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "Colonel Thorne," he boomed, his voice like cracking rock. "Report. I have been monitoring this fiasco from my command flight. Who is the imbecile who sent an armored convoy into the Al-Qadir Pass without air cover in a developing storm?" Thorne paled, snapping to attention. "General Sterling, sir. The responsibility is mine. I misjudged the intelligence. Sterling waved a dismissive hand, his eyes sweeping the room with blistering contempt. He was about to unleash a tirade that would undoubtedly end Thorne's career when his gaze fell upon the quiet figure of Anya Petrova, who was standing by the map table, observing the general with a calm, unreadable expression. The general stopped. He froze mid-stride, his mouth slightly agape. The fury on his face evaporated, replaced by a cascade of emotions that were utterly alien to the man. Disbelief, then shock, then a wave of something that looked shockingly like fear. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Every officer present felt the shift, the sudden, terrifying change in their legendary commander. Sterling's gaze was locked on Anya, his face ashen. The man who commanded fleets and armies, who had faced down dictators and terrorists without flinching, was staring at the old logistics clerk as if he had just seen a ghost walk out of its grave. He took a slow, hesitant step forward, and then another. The two aides behind him exchanged bewildered glances. The entire TOC was silent, watching this bizarre, tense tableau unfold. Sterling finally stopped a few feet from her. His voice, when it came out, was not a boom but a choked, incredulous whisper that barely carried across the room. Kestrel, the name hung in the air, meaningless to everyone except the two people at the center of the drama. Anya looked at the formidable general, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not emotion but recognition, showed in her eyes. A past she had buried deep was clawing its way back into the light. "It has been a long time, James," she said, her voice quiet, using his first name with a familiarity that was itself a monumental shock. General James Sterling stared at her for a second longer, his mind clearly reeling. He then spun around to face the stunned and utterly confused Colonel Thorne. The fear in the general's eyes had been replaced by a terrifying intensity. "Colonel," Sterling said, his voice low and trembling with a strange new energy, "do you have any idea who this is?" He didn't wait for an answer. He jabbed a finger toward Anya. "Get me her file. Not the civilian personnel record. Her real file. Use my override. Authorization Sterling Omega 09. Search for the call sign, Kestrel." A nervous communications officer fumbled at his keyboard. Colonel Thorne looked from the four-star general to the quiet clerk, his mind unable to bridge the impossible gap between them. Kestrel? The name meant nothing to him. The officer at the terminal typed in the authorization codes. A red warning flashed on the screen. Classified. Eyes only, Omega level. He bypassed it with the general's code. A file appeared, and on the screen, a photograph of Anya Petrova, 25 years younger, her face hard and lean, her eyes burning with a chilling intensity. Below it, a list of code names and operations that were the secret, whispered legends of the intelligence community. The Ghost of Sevastopol, architect of Operation Silent Talon, lead interrogator, Black Site Indigo. The last entry read, Anya Petrova, codename Kestrel, declared Kia Year 10, Eastern Sector. File sealed. Sterling's voice was grim. She wasn't killed in action. She was the one who walked away. She retired herself. We buried an empty casket and scrubbed her from the records to protect her. He looked at Thorne, his eyes filled with a terrifying, almost hysterical clarity. "Colonel, you didn't just dismiss a clerk. You ordered the Kestrel to go count blankets." A profound, bottomless silence descended upon the Tactical Operations Center. The weight of the general's words settled over the room, crushing every preconception, every assumption. The file on the screen was an artifact from a shadow world, a world of ghosts and assassins, of operations so secret they were denied even by the agencies that ran them. And the architect of that world was standing right there, in a plain work shirt, her hair gray, her face impassive. Colonel Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. He looked from the chilling dossier on the screen to the woman he had belittled in front of his entire command staff. The goat trails, the geological surveys, the calm, precise navigation through a blind hell. It all snapped into focus, not as the cleverness of a clerk, but as the ingrained, instinctual expertise of a master operative. He felt a wave of shame so profound it was physically nauseating. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. General Sterling, his composure regained but his demeanor forever altered, turned back to face Anya. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering, and almost reverent respect. He straightened his shoulders, his back becoming ramrod straight. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand to his brow. He executed a perfect salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory gesture he gave to subordinates. It was the slow, solemn salute of a soldier to a monarch, of a warrior to a legend. It was an act of fealty. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Major Coulson, his face a mask of awe, stiffened and brought his own hand up in a salute. Then the captain next to him. Then another officer and another. In a silent, spreading wave, every single uniformed person in the room, from the highest-ranking captain to the lowest-level specialist, turned to face Anya Petrova and rendered a salute. At his comm station, Corporal Kenji Tanaka stood up, his chair scraping on the floor. His eyes were shining with tears of pure, unadulterated reverence. He, too, saluted the woman who had let him bring her coffee. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the electronics and the fading howl of the storm, which now seemed like a respectful silence. Anya Petrova stood in the center of it all, a small, unassuming figure who had, without raising her voice or firing a shot, brought an entire command structure to its knees in silent admiration. She was no longer a clerk. She was a monument. Anya did not salute back. She was not a soldier. Not anymore. That part of her life was a ghost, a story sealed in a classified file. To return the salute would be to acknowledge a rank and a role she had deliberately shed. Instead, she held the gaze of General Sterling and the assembled officers, and she gave a single, short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, not of acceptance. It was enough. The message was clear. The respect was noted. The debt of her humiliation repaid. Now there was work to do. The tension broke. The salutes were dropped. The officers, moving with a new, deferential energy, turned back to their stations to execute the plan she had laid out. The rescue team was dispatched, melting into the storm-drenched landscape with a speed and efficiency born of renewed purpose. The drone was prepped. Crimson One was guided towards the rendezvous point. The entire operation now moved with the flawless precision of a well-oiled machine, all its parts suddenly aligned by a single brilliant mind. Later that evening, long after the rescue was confirmed successful and the convoy survivors were safely in the med bay, Colonel Thorne found Anya back in the quartermaster's office. The container was quiet. Sergeant Miles and the two young specialists were gone, having been reassigned by Major Coulson to latrine duty for the foreseeable future. Her desk was no longer cluttered. It was immaculate. Someone, he suspected Corporal Tanaka, had placed a new, high-end tactical laptop on it, next to a fresh pot of black coffee. Thorne stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a posture of supplication he hadn't adopted since he was a cadet. "Ma'am," he began, his voice rough with emotion. The word felt natural now. There are no words. My conduct was inexcusable. I want to formally apologize." Anya looked up from a manifest she was reviewing on the new laptop. It was a list of medical supplies for the men of Crimson One. Her focus was already on the next problem, the next logistical not to be untangled. "The apology is unnecessary, Colonel," she said, her voice even. "Ego doesn't keep soldiers warm at night. What is necessary is that your men got back safely, and that they have dry blankets and proper medical attention." She gestured to the list on her screen. "Your infirmary is short on coagulation agents. I've put in a priority requisition from the main depot. It should be on the next flight." She turned back to her work. The conversation was over. The lesson was clear. The mission was all that mattered. Her vindication was not in his apology, but in the lives that had been saved. Her victory was not over him, but over the chaos that threatened their survival. Thorne stood there for a long moment watching her work. He finally understood. She didn't need his respect. She had earned it, and in the process had taught him what true leadership looked like. It wasn't about giving orders. It was about taking responsibility. He placed his hat back on his head, gave a small, respectful nod to her back, and left her to her duties. The final image of Anya Petrova at FOB Nightingale was not one of her in the TOC, surrounded by saluting officers. It was of her, standing alone at dusk near the perimeter fence. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a brilliant, bruised purple. The desert was calm, the heat of the day bleeding into a cool, silent evening. She was looking out at the vast, empty expanse, her hands clasped behind her back. She wasn't studying the fence for weaknesses anymore. She was looking at the horizon. General Sterling had offered her anything she wanted. A commission, a high-level advisory role at command, a quiet and luxurious retirement funded by a grateful government. She had refused it all. "I have a job, General," she had told him. "There are blankets to be counted." He had understood. The world of shadows and secrets, of call signs and black operations, was her past. It was a heavy coat she had taken off and folded away. Here, in the dust and the grind of a forgotten outpost, she had found a different kind of purpose. It was a quiet, thankless, essential job. It was a place where her skills could still serve, but without the cost to her soul. She had been dismissed, and she had endured. She had been tested, and she had prevailed. She had not sought respect, but she had commanded it through sheer, undeniable competence. As the first stars began to appear in the desert sky, Anya Petrova stood her silent watch. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a clerk. She was Kestrel. She was the ghost. But here, now, she was simply Anya, a woman who knew the value of a dry blanket and a safe route home. And in the quiet dignity of her chosen obscurity, she had found a peace that all the medals and commendations in the world could never offer.